Thanks very much for the invitation to speak. It's always good to explore how the Australian community so far away on the other side of the world down under can help the European community and Flex in particular. So my name is Will Woodgate and I'm a research fellow at the University of Queensland in the Earth Observation Research Centre. I'm also a joint appointment with the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network, which is a collaborative infrastructure network all across Australia, and also affiliate with CSIRO. So this presentation's got multiple parts to it, and after providing some brief context about SIF, I'll then focus on a range of related activities, focusing at the Tumbarumba research site, which is pictured on this slide, and also the one behind me. So the work that I'll be diving into is focusing on interpreting freely available satellite data as part 2 of this presentation at a research site affected by bushfire. So I'd also like to thank the many collaborators that make this work possible, especially those at Melbourne University, CSIRO, UQ and TERN. I'd also like to acknowledge traditional custodians on the land in which we meet. So I'm currently on Gubbi Gubbi land, and I'd like to pay my respects to the ancestors and descendants who continue the cultural connection to country. So a bit of very brief background, because I know I'm speaking to the SIF experts out there. So what is SIF? It's a faint glow produced by plants who are photosynthesizing, which is detectable from certain hyperspectral sensors, including those in satellites. It can be very dynamic and provides a direct window of insight into photosynthetic function, including stresses affecting plant function. So the main drivers of SIF are typically sun intensity, light history, chlorophyll concentration, and a whole bunch of other stresses that operate at all different timescales. We've had SIF measuring satellites for around 10 to 15 years. And even though none of the current satellites were built for SIF, apart from the upcoming Flex mission, which makes it very exciting, we can see here that we've got a global map of Tropomi's SIF, and we can see that in terms of the SIF intensity, we have more SIF coming off the high biomass tropical regions around the world. And this has been shown to be very promising for monitoring vegetation productivity and seasonality, which the next few slides will go into more detail. So SIF made a big splash around 2017 because it was shown to be highly correlated with flux tower GPP, where flux towers are sites that measure carbon and water exchange at the canopy scale. So really gold standard measurements of photosynthesis and photosynthetic processes. However, since this study, there's been over 100 papers analyzing SIF relationship to GPP, showing quite some variability among ecosystems, mainly due to canopy structure, composition, photosynthetic pathways, averaging timeframes, all sorts of issues. And SIF has also been demonstrated to be more accurate and robust performance across a range of vegetation communities compared to the traditional greener space metrics. So here on the right-hand side, we have OCO2 SIF versus MODIS GPP, which is a productivity product developed from greener space indices of the MODIS sensor. You can see it's not tightly coupled as we see with SIF and flux tower GPP. So another nice example to demonstrate this point is from Nawat Ridge with Troy Magny's paper. And we can see here in the top plot, NDVI, so greenness, is flat across the entire year because this is a mix of pine, spruce, and fir species, which are all evergreen coniferous species. However, there's quite a distinct seasonal cycle in GPP and productivity, which is in black, and that also tracks very well the SIF from a tower-based spectrometer. So we can see here a big decoupling from the greener space metrics, which are typically used to upscale GPP, and those from SIF. So that was the end of the background section. Now I'd like to focus on an Australian site for the rest of the presentation. So the Australian site is called Tumbarumba. It's located in Southeast Australia in a cool temperate climate at the foothills of the Snowy Mountains. It's a tall productive ash forest in a state forest that's been managed for timber production for over 100 years. It's monitored and survived major disturbance events such as insect attacks, droughts, heat waves, lightning strikes, and now a major bushfire. So it's a flux tower instrumentation and has been one of the Southern Hemisphere's longest running flux tower sites. So since 2001. So before the 2019-20 bushfire that affected the site, we've had several spectral monitoring systems on the tower, and they'll be the subject of the next few slides. So as a Flux Tower enabled spectral equipment site, Tumbarumba has become a member of SpecNet. So it's a collaborative network of these kinds of spectrally enabled sites. And for a bit of background, these sites continuously observe a wide range of structural and functional metrics, including carbon and water uptake, meteorology, canopy structure, soil properties. So basically, really intense measurements over long periods of time so we can understand the drivers of change for process-based understanding at the site level. So around 2015, we have had this system installed called BEMS, which is a combined hyperspectral and thermal monitoring system. So the hyperspectral imager line scanner is the head wall, and we have a FLIR camera as well. So that was mounted at the top of the tower, protected by a radiation shield, mounted on top of a pan tilt unit. So it could spin around and collect panoramic imagery. Being a hyperspectral near infrared imager, it was quite big data. So we've got an archive of over 55 terabytes over a number of years. And this is all mentioned in a descriptive paper listed here. So an example of some of the outputs of the hyperspectral and thermal cameras. You can see here panoramic image. I've got sunlit area of the canopy on the left-hand side down to very fine spatial level of detail in through to the shaded part of the canopy here. And you can see here that the temperature panels, you can see that the sunlit canopy is warmer than the shaded canopy, as would expect. Very clear sky day. So it was a perfect hyperspectral day. So from that really high temporal resolution hyperspectral data, we could derive indices. So in the top panel here, we see 1 year's worth of data for NDVI, so the green and space index, compared with GPP from a flux tower in the middle panel and incoming radiation in the bottom panel. So at this cool temperate site, the productivity is mostly driven by sunlight. So you can see here that in winter time, which is flipped from the northern hemisphere, we have the low fluxes of carbon and then maximum sunlight, maximum GPP. Whereas interestingly, at this site, it's very decoupled from greenness. So a bit like Troy's site in Niwot Ridge. So we have maximum greenness in the middle of winter. And importantly, the blue dots represent those measurements where the sky conditions were rapidly changing. So it took around 90 seconds to build up that panoramic image, and we're constantly collecting 1 second incoming radiation data, so we could then color by the stability of the sky. So when we filter out the blue dots, get a really clean time series of NDVI in the top panel. So from that kind of data, we can extract many different kinds of spectral metrics, including PRI, and also PRI type index that was developed especially for our research site from pigment level data, and that tracked the seasonality much better than NDVI and a whole bunch of other different standard vegetation indices. So moving on into fluorescence. So towards the end of 2019, we installed a Phlox, but added some modifications to it. So we've got the Phlox box here, which mounts to the top of the tower. Inside it is the QE Pro spectrometer and a flame spectrometer to measure SIF and vis near infrared reflectance. It's all connected through fiber optic cables. And then at the top of the tower here, underneath the platform, we've got a pan tilt unit and the fiber optic cables. So what we can do is we program the Phlox to measure multi-angular SIF throughout the canopy, because we're really interested in seeing what this effect was in this complex type forest environment. So what those measurements look like on a polar plot, looking straight down like a compass, we can see here we were measuring 14 different viewing angles every half an hour and cycling through that continuously. So we can see these 14 different measurement locations with a gap here, which is due to the tower obstructing the field of view of the sensor. So when retrieving SIF, the off-the-shelf algorithms didn't work particularly well. So that's what we see here. We see 1 day's worth of data, so a time course, and these different techniques for extracting SIF from the oxygen A and B bands using the IFLD and SFM techniques. So we can see here that for a perfectly sunny day, which is the red line here, our SIF in black gave us negative SIF values at peak intensity. So that was due to the fact that this is quite a tall tower. So it's a 70-meter tower with a 40-meter canopy. So we had quite a long path length between the SIF sensor and the canopy. So when applying some corrections for the oxygen absorption in that path length, using a low train approach and then a high train approach, we can see that we're getting much more sensible SIF values that follow the incoming sunlight, as we would expect. So those black dots might look like a lot of noise, but in reality, because we're measuring multi-angular, that noise is actually information about the sunlit shaded proportions of the canopy. So here I've colored two different viewing geometries, one due north, so you see quite a symmetric behavior of SIF throughout the day, and then one to the west, which is more sunlit in the morning. So you see here SIF peaking in the morning before declining throughout the day. So unfortunately, that instrument was only measuring for 3 months before the bushfire came in, but I'll get into that in a few different slides. So related to that work is some additional work around characterizing the site for 3D structure and also the spectral properties at the leaf level. So with colleagues, we scanned the site and reconstructed the point cloud into 3D tree models. So why did we do that? Well, so we reconstructed, instead of the entire 1 hectare plot, a representative selection of different structural characteristics from small to big trees to get that nice representation across the diversity at the site. So once we have the spectral and structural characteristics, we can then use that as an input into a 3D radiative transfer model. So this is a Dart simulation from colleagues, and we can see here the simulation, and to contrast the simulation and see how we performed in real life, we also have a UAV hyperspectral image from UTAS colleagues. And then when we look at the degree of match in the spectral properties, we can see here quite a nice match, giving us confidence in our parameterization for that site. We also have a lot of additional data going into that. So with the leaf level reflectance and pigment properties, colleagues recalibrated the FluSpec model to get much more accurate calibration coefficients for that model to give us more accurate leaf spectra. So now moving on to the second part of the talk, which is really about the bushfire and understanding how satellite metrics and SIF can tell a story of bushfire recovery at this Tumbarumba research site. And if you'd like to read more about this study, it was published recently in the Remote Sensing of Environment journal. So the overall question that this study was looking at was, is SIF a suitable proxy of photosynthesis for this research site? And especially, is it suitable when we have pre and post-fire conditions that can be quite different in terms of structure and composition of the species? Also, how does SIF compare to commonly used satellite greenness metrics and burn severity metrics? So for example, Enhanced Vegetation Index, NDVI, infrared V, and also the normalized burn ratio were investigated. And lastly, because they're all optical 2D signals, we want to know a bit more about canopy structure. So looking at the JEDI spaceborne LiDAR sensor, was that also a useful window of insight into tracking structural recovery at this site scale? So again, focusing on the Tumbarumba site, which I've already introduced. So those 3 main satellite signals, we've got Sentinel-2 and the indices calculated from that. So the 4 main indices on the right-hand side here. Tropomi SIF, we use day length corrected SIF. And also JEDI LiDAR, we're looking at leaf area index, canopy cover, and the vertical profile of structural information. A really nice thing about heavily researched site like Tumbarumba is the plethora of data that we have access to. So on the canopy structure side, we have in situ laser scanner that's fully autonomous, which is called a leaf sensor. So that gives us a point cloud every single day. So very high temporal resolution to monitor fine scale changes in canopy structure. At the same time, we have a more traditional approach to measuring canopy structure with upward looking hemispherical photos, which give us canopy openness and also leaf and plant area index. Then we have the more traditional approaches, so the inventory type approaches for measuring what's happening at the plot scale on the ground, and also more higher end laser scanner, which was only used once pre and post fire to get a very high density coverage of the site as a point cloud. So that's a canopy structure side. On the flux side of things, so I've got the flux tower measuring carbon and water exchange with an infrared gas analyzer and sonic anemometer, located at around 70 meters in height, about 30 meters above the canopy. So that gives us ecosystem scale fluxes. The footprint varies with wind direction and wind conditions, but typically it's a few hundred meters around the tower as a radius. So that's the canopy scale fluxes. We're also lucky enough to have a database of leaf level fluxes from instruments like the Lycor 6400 and 6800. So here pictured for 6800. So it's got a gas exchange chamber here. We clip the leaf in and can measure the leaf level fluxes of carbon water exchange in very controlled conditions. So that's the flux side of things to measure photosynthesis. Then the spectral side of things, as Earth observationalists and remote sensors, this is what we're really interested in. So we also have a number of different observational time periods where we measured leaf level spectral end members with an ASD spectrometer. So here we see Spinyak in one of the field campaigns, I think around 2019, measuring with our different leaf level spectral equipment. And we also have leaf level SIF. So this was from a modified Lycor 6800. So this is the Lycor 6800 unit here. So the measuring head and the control unit, but also this was modified with two QE Pros. So one QE Pro here and one QE Pro here that goes into the top and bottom of the chamber. So at the same time as measuring the leaf level fluxes, we could measure leaf level spectral fluxes of reflectance, transmittance, as well as the full fluorescence spectrum under very controlled conditions. So 2019-20 was a really bad time in Australia for bushfires. Around 18.6 million hectares were burnt across that black summer, which was due to unprecedented dry and hot conditions. So in 2019, on New Year's Eve, not a good time to celebrate for this site, it was impacted by a bushfire. So it was impacted by the Duns Road mega fire that burnt around 90% of the state forest, which is 50,000 hectares of eucalypt trees. So in total, around 600,000 hectares across the southwestern slopes of New South Wales and Victoria were affected by this one bushfire. So in Bago State Forest, which is this map here, and the site in the middle, it was mostly burnt to around a medium kind of intensity burn severity. So what did that look like? So this is ground zero a few weeks after the fire. Luckily, the tower was still standing, but the fire was a very hot, fast-moving fire, which consumed all of the understory vegetation and took out all of our equipment on the ground. So nothing survived on the ground apart from the tower, which was very lucky for us. So you can see here, there's no vegetation left on the ground. But interestingly, the canopy was still intact. So at first it was green, but then we discovered that due to radiant heat damage, all of the foliage in the canopy was damaged and therefore started to fall off and completely defoliate over a number of months. So you can see here from a drone image, 2 months after the fire, all the leaves you can see are very dry, but we can start to see some recovery in terms of grasses on the ground and some epicomic regrowth in one of the two species. The fascinating story about the recovery of the species at this site is there's two main overstory species, ash and gum, with very different reproductive strategies and fire tolerances. So the ash species are very fire sensitive, so they all perished at the site. And they resprout after a fire and a cold winter. So that's their reproductive strategy. Whereas the gum, they're fire tolerant, so then they resprout with epicomic regrowth up the branches. So that's what we can see here, this epicomic regrowth really taking off. This is 5 months post-fire. You can still see some leaves that are still falling from the canopy, which is why we have the dry leaves on the ground, and the grasses are really starting to take off. So you can start to build up a picture of how this site is recovering on the ground, so then we can help to better interpret what the satellite signals are telling us, which I'll go through in a couple of slides. So now fast forwarding a bit over a year after the fire, we had a proliferation of grasses growing much taller than we had before the fire. That's because the canopy was mostly defoliated and a lot more light is now reaching the ground for the shrubs and grasses to take off, and really thick, bushy epicomic regrowth up our gum trees. So in 2021, a bit over a year post-fire, we also did an inventory measurement to record what was happening at great level of detail in the 1 hectare monitoring plot. So we saw some very promising signs of recovery. Over 60 species were identified, which were close to the pre-fire levels. We had very high proliferation of delicatensis, so ash recruitment, up to 200 seedlings per square meter. So the team had their work cut out tagging all of those at the quadrat level. So now moving on to the satellite data. So in this panel up here, we have SIF in black. So this is Tropomi, so only started here for us to start measuring. And then we have a number of years before the fire, which is denoted at 2020, and then a couple of years post-fire for this study. So in green, we have flux tower GPP, so carbon uptake, as a benchmark measurement of photosynthesis. So we can see here a very nice seasonal cycle before the fire, abrupt change from the fire, a gap in our fluxes because the tower was impacted. It took us a year to get measuring again with the flux tower, but we have this gap covered through our satellite data. So you can see here a big drop in SIF, but then a SIF on average, this is the black line as a fitted moving window average, was around 0 after the fire. So it's quite a nice interpretation. Even though we had green leaves, they weren't photosynthesizing, so we had 0 SIF. So this is a scatter plot looking at SIF on the x-axis and flux tower GPP on the y-axis, split into pre and post-fire conditions with the 2 different colors. So we can see here pre-fire, even though it's a noisy relationship, it's a very different line, best fit line compared to post-fire. So that tells us straight away that probably caution using the same regression fit if we want to extrapolate pre-fire conditions to post-fire conditions in terms of flux tower photosynthesis. So that's just SIF. And we also looked at the other spectral indices from Sentinel-2 satellite. So we have the Enhanced Vegetation Index in black, NDVI in blue, and then also canopy structure measurements in this fuchsia color as well to see how that was changing through time. And you can see here very distinct relationships between pre and post-fire NDVI and GPP, as well as EVI and GPP. And finally, we've got the burn ratio as well, with all showing very distinct drops after the fire. So what does it all look like if we tie it together as the recovery index, which is just normalizing these values to a pre-fire maximum? So focusing first on the green line, which is our flux tower GPP, we only saw a 50% recovery of GPP compared to pre-fire levels. So that's around the 0.5 recovery index. Whereas our spectral metrics, so our green space metrics like NDVI and EVI, almost fully recovered after 2 years post-fire. So a big discrepancy in recovery rate from our spectral properties compared to our photosynthetic properties. So why was that? Well, the photo showed a massive change in canopy structure. So here we're looking at a vertical profile of vegetation density from a terrestrial laser scanner in the first column and the JEDI satellite in the right-hand column here. So pre-fire, we can see a very healthy dense canopy up around 35 meters and a massive change in canopy density post-fire as recorded by the terrestrial laser scanner and a big increase in understory. JEDI, we could see that there was a big drop in the upper canopy, but there's a lot of uncertainty in JEDI around 5 meters. It's only a 5 meter averaging interval, so it's much harder to tell what's going on at the understory level with JEDI. But both showed a nice agreement in terms of a big magnitude of drop of canopy density. However, at the site scale level, JEDI is a global subsampling mission. It's not quite suited to wall-to-wall coverage. So we have sometimes a massive gap in time frequency between our measurements. So in 2019, in October, we had some measurements, and then the next measurements we had that were close to the site, multi-kilometer radius, was over a year and a half later from JEDI sampling. So this is planetary index and fractional cover metrics from JEDI. So now diving into more detail, let's look at the leaf level information. So what's happening at the leaf level in terms of our fluxes? So here we see a light response curve, so incoming radiation on the x-axis and photosynthesis on the y-axis from our leaf level gas exchange data, colored or shown for different vegetation types. So we've got our overstory photosynthetic response curve in this black line. Shrubs and grasses are much less productive down here. And then when we remeasured in 2020, so this is pre-fire up the top here, very productive leaves and canopy. post-fire epicomic leaves, because we didn't have any canopy leaves post-fire, showed around the same kind of level of productivity as our grasses and shrubs. So even though they showed a very similar, let's say, density in terms of leaf area index shifted to now the ground instead of the canopy, they have very different photosynthetic capacity. So that also helps explain why we see a much bigger drop in photosynthesis. In terms of looking at leaf level SIF, so in terms of the overstory species and shrubs, this is just post-fire data. So overstory is the epicomic regrowth leaves. The SIF as a function of incoming radiation was very similar for shrubs and overstory. So even though they have different photosynthetic capacity, they have a similar SIF. So just something to keep in mind. So what does this all mean? Tying it all together. So pre-fire, we had a lot more SIF and then NDVI, a lot of CO2 flux. Post-fire, halving our CO2 flux, very different canopy structure, a lot lower SIF, but the greenness was much higher as well. So the greenness indices like NDVI and EVI recovered a lot faster than our SIF and our canopy fluxes. So that was mostly because of the composition change. So both the structure changed and the composition, changing from really healthy overstory trees to now mostly dominated site with grasses and shrubs. So I'd like to explain just a little bit more about this leaf level system, which combines leaf level fluxes of the gas exchange as well as the spectral fluxes. So diving into a bit more detail, here's a schematic of what it looks like. So we've got a photosynthetic measurement chamber here with our leaf in the middle. The QE Pro goes in the top and the bottom to measure a small area of interest of the leaf. And we've got two QE Pros here on the right-hand side showing us what we get in terms of upwelling and transmitted fluxes of radiance, as well as the fluorescent spectra. So all spectrally resolved. And the nice thing about this system is we can also measure active fluorescence at the same time as passive fluorescence to understand how those different yields are changing. This is what it looks like up close. So this is working with Lycor to develop this system in around 2020. So here's some outputs of this leaf level system. So one light response curve for a single leaf. So you can see here productivity is a function of incoming radiation. This is a photosynthetic yield from the active fluorometry unit, so PAN. So you can see how the quantum yield of photosystem 2 decreases as light intensity increases, and the electron transport rate is increasing, similar to net photosynthesis. So on top of that, we've got our fully spectrally resolved fluxes. So we can measure the maximum fluorescence when we have the pulse firing at maximum saturating light intensity. So we can look at the maximum fluorescence, the minimum fluorescence, which is a bit more noisy because it's such a low signal, and also just the steady state fluorescence from the different light levels throughout the light response curve. A really neat feature of this system is we can also measure the reflectance and transmittance, and therefore absorption fluxes of the leaf. So at this level of detail for a full light response curve, they all kind of look about the same. So we have to really zoom in to see any kind of changes. So this is a set of leaves at the site of the epicomic regrowth leaves post-fire. So we zoom right in to see the changes. We can see very, very subtle changes through the light response curve in reflectance and transmittance and absorption. So what could possibly explain, the kind of behavior that we're seeing? So interestingly enough, there was a paper that was this purely modeling paper looking at chloroplast changes due to different light intensity, basically the chloroplast hiding from high intensity light stacking on top of one another. And the changes here that we see in terms of changing reflectance and absorption really closely mimicked the changes that we observed with our real data. That was a lot of information to cover across different scales, across different instruments. But just a flavor of some of the work that we've done at one research site. It'll be, I know that the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network that I'm a part of has a lot of different measurements and capabilities that could also further support the FLEX mission and the different products that will be developed into the future.